Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for watching. I want to briefly cover Chapter 10, some of the highlights on communicating effectively as a sport manager within an organization. And I want to use a recent example from Major League Baseball and the World Series, and specifically Justin Turner and his decision to go back out onto the field to celebrate with his Dodger teammates as they won the World Series 2 nights ago. But I want to use that to just give fun examples of the challenge of communicating well in the middle of a complex decision. But let's just give a general comment that something we've been saying in class throughout the weeks is that communication is a key skill for sport managers to possess in all processes of management, whether you're planning for strategy in line with the mission, or whether you're organizing your team in order to work the plan, or even as you lead people and motivate them and delegate, and you increase the positive culture, the psychological elements that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. And even as you evaluate your plan, communicating effectively and using proper channels of communication and recognizing the nuance of effective communication is a key skill. It's not just a people skill, but we have to be able to communicate technical information well as to communicate as we think conceptually and as we make plans. Again, in short, communication is key. So here's a nice little quote that summarizes it much better than I just did. The best managers talk better than the rest of us. And if we can talk nice, if we can talk positively, and if we can talk appropriately in a well-timed way, then we can accomplish more. We can influence people better. And we can make more effective and even efficient decisions, if you buy the argument that the best managers talk better than the rest of us. So let's get started and let's introduce the case that I want to use here briefly. For those non-baseball fans, if you did not watch the Dodgers win the World Series on Tuesday night, you will probably know that Major League Baseball played in kind of a modified bubble this year because of COVID. So they did not use a true bubble like the NBA or the National Hockey League did, but they, as more and more players began testing positive for COVID, Major League Baseball tightened the bubble and did a modified bubble where players could only interact in small circles in their home stadiums, and then they got tested regularly. Well, Major League Baseball was pretty responsible and precise in their testing, and yet those of you who followed baseball this year, you'll remember that in the beginning, in the early days of the season especially, a lot of games were canceled, and we wondered if we would even pull off the season. 43 regular season games were canceled. Here's an article that I was just reading that I was pulling these details from, and Major League Baseball was hours away from really pulling off a fantastic postseason of play, even in the middle of the pandemic. And then Justin Turner tested positive in between games 5 and 6, sort of in the middle of the night, and tests come back, and not in the middle of the night, early morning, and then Major League Baseball communicates it with the Dodgers organization, with the owner, Mark Walter. Mark Walter calls the director of baseball operations, Andrew Friedman. Friedman calls Dave Roberts, the manager, and all the while, this takes some time, and Dave Roberts pulls Justin Turner from the game in the middle of the 7th inning. If you know the story, Justin Turner sat out for an inning and a half. The Dodgers won in the top of the 9th. And then Turner was supposed to be in isolation, completely alone, and he was supposed to go home, shortly thereafter. And yet, he decided to go back on the field, even though he was told not to. And he wanted to celebrate with his teammates. And so he wore a mask, and then he took the mask off for pictures. You see one of the big pictures right here, where he was front and center, right next to Dave Roberts, who is not a young man, probably shouldn't get COVID. and Turner was out there celebrating with the team. So you have this interesting dynamic of a potential problem for Major League Baseball in terms of public relations. There's obvious implications here for how Major League Baseball should communicate through this potential problem. So I want to break it down, I want to talk about it, and then ultimately I want to push it back to you and give you a chance for extra credit points. So for those of you who are watching this video, congratulations. You have an opportunity at the end of this to give some short responses to a couple of questions that I asked. Submit it to me through email, and you'll get 10 points of extra credit. Okay, so congratulations if you watched. Here's a reward for your watching this video. So let's talk through some communication basics. We will not cover every specific detail in the chapter. I leave that to you to read a little bit more closely. But communication is just about information transmission. And your job as the manager is to transmit relevant information in the appropriate way at the appropriate time in order to build culture, in order to accomplish strategy, in order to fulfill mission, and even in order to motivate people and keep people happy and satisfied and working in the same direction. Yeah? So it's this big, complex process, which at the end of the day is kind of simple. You transmit information. And you do this through two primary ways. Through the organization. If you are more of a top-down organization where there's a senior management level and then different levels of lower managers, and then you have kind of an operating core at the bottom, let's say, then the communication could be much more formal from the top down. If you have a more lateral structure, like we talked about in the second and third chapters of the planning function, then there could be some crosstalk and some intermixing of organizational communication and interpersonal communication. But for now, organizational communication takes place among the organization's divisions, and interpersonal communication takes place between people. But a key skill in both of these processes is you need, as the leader, to facilitate this communication in ways that enhance and motivate and align with the mission. Yeah? So I need to be aware of my own communication strategies, and then I need to be aware of what the organization needs. So formal communication within the organization can occur in either a vertical way or a horizontal way. I already briefly spoke about this, but vertical communication is downward. It's the organizational chart. It's the communication that occurs because of the nature of the organizational chart. Remember, way back in the planning function of our text, we talked about the structure of the organization can facilitate the function or the efficiency of that organization and how things get done. Well, there's no better example of that than in communication. If you have an unnecessarily vertical or structure where there are just multiple layers of managers, then often communication can be slow, it can be chunky, it can be even frustrating and inconsistent because each level has to, what we'll talk about in a few slides, they have to code the message, and then the sender and then the listener has to uncode it and interpret what that means, and then slowly over time it trickles down to the typical worker in the organization. And this can be slow, and this can be unnecessarily inefficient. Or it can be very efficient, but vertical communication is just the normal flow of information through the organization. And in a word, it's the official line of information. It's the press release that the organization has a long time to think about before, or sometimes a shorter time to think about, but they package it and it's more controlled. It's not a tweet in the middle of the night. It's an officially sanctioned piece of information that is designed intentionally to point back to the mission, to reinforce core values of the organization, or in the case of a policy or a rule like Major League Baseball, to remind people of the rule and the policy, in this case, protecting all the athletes from an increased risk of COVID infection. By contrast, horizontal communication is information shared among peers. That could be, the Dodgers front office, where they're cross-talking before they issue the press release, or it could be players on the field as they welcome Justin Turner back and say, hey, come on the field. We know you're not supposed to be here, but maintain social distance, wear a mask. We want you on the field to celebrate with us. So this is coordinated communication among team members and departments, and it can happen more quickly than vertical communication, and it can be less formal, obviously, than vertical communication. But the key skill for you as a sport manager is to seek a positive communication culture in whichever format, vertical or horizontal, that you are communicating. So here's kind of a silly emoji that's no longer true, since this is Tom Brady and this is Bill Belichick, and Tom Brady is no longer a New England Patriot, but I still like it. There was this mutual respect and understanding, even if they didn't necessarily see eye to eye and everything, and even if there was some tension, they always came across in their externally in their communication as if they were trying to, one up each other. You're better. No, you're better. So this idea that sometimes creating a culture of positive communication can feel like you're working too hard, and yet when we see organizations functioning well, and certainly organizations that I've been a part of where the communication is good, it often is because the communication is positive, sometimes unusually so. But my challenge to you is to remember we're trying to build positive culture. So leaders need to seek positive communication. Still sincere, still authentic, but positive communication in both vertical and horizontal ways. The horizontal communication danger that we'll talk about is what we call the grapevine, which could quickly turn into gossip or negative conversation between peers in an organization. And this is something that we have to be careful of and to protect against. So let's apply it with our case. Congratulations, you are now the commissioner of Major League Baseball, and you have inherited this nice little public relations problem where Justin Turner is now on the field with the world to see and take pictures. And Major League Baseball has set up this nice system of testing, and you made it all the way through to the last game of the World Series and almost the last inning of the World Series, and then a player openly violates a policy and a rule. Good for you. You are Rob Manfred. Now you get to work through this decision-making process, and you get to decide how to communicate. Well, Manfred already communicated yesterday, I think, and he basically said this. In commenting on Turner's decision, he said, while a desire to celebrate is understandable, Turner's decision to leave isolation and enter the field was wrong and put everyone he came in contact with at risk. So this is an example of formal communication that reinforces policy and reinforces Major League Baseball. The mission, in this case, the mission related to COVID, was to protect athletes and to protect those involved with Major League Baseball. So he was reinforcing policy and mission through formal, quick communication in the media. The question for you later on is, do you agree with that type of formal communication? Could he have just let it go and not issued a formal statement? Or did he handle it well? Okay, so now let's get into this idea of informal communication, which is sometimes called the grapevine. This is the flow of unsanctioned information through informal channels among people in your organization, on the team. This is a good, natural, normal part of everyday life. And yet it can often, as you see in our very instant communication environment of social media and middle-of-the-night tweets and, different Instagram posts and things, precise information can quickly turn into hearsay, rumors, or even gossip. It may be true, it may be untrue, but the truth for sure is that grapevine informal information can and often does complicate the effectiveness of your communication as a sport leader. So then, this is why Major League Baseball needs probably to continue to issue messages through media channels in order to effectively mitigate the informal and hearsay sort of messages that might be coming up from players and people within Major League Baseball. So as Rob Manfred, the commissioner, you get to monitor media and monitor this grapevine informal level of information. And I just give you two examples of the type of informal communication that's already occurring. Justin Turner, all throughout the playoffs, Turner has been a member of the Major League Baseball Players Association. He heard some of the rules that Major League Baseball was proposing, and he basically supported them and gave quotes throughout the playoffs suggesting, here's October 19, the day before Game 1. I think it's ultimately a testament to the players for being responsible and making good choices and doing everything that we had to do to ensure the season was able to go. So I tip my cap to every player who put the uniform on and took risk, but was also responsible and did it the right way to enable us to have a full season. So there's a history here where he's supporting the policy of testing and personal protective equipment and responsibility by players, and yet ultimately he was irresponsible in the final game. This is Friedman, the president of operations, or a vice president in the Dodgers organization. This is Manfred on top, but Friedman also weighed in and protected Turner a little bit. So he's starting to issue informal communication in the media as well. That again, whether well-intentioned or ill-intentioned isn't the point. It complicates the message, yeah? Having a mask on and staying socially distanced. Turner wanted to come out and take a picture with the trophy. We can't state strongly enough how big a role Turner played for this organization. Ooh. So now the vice president of the Dodgers is engaged in hearsay, yeah, and suggesting that he understands Turner's intent, and we do too as fans of the game. We say let the guy go out and celebrate with his team, and yet this can complicate the communication message coming from Major League Baseball. That's the point I want to make. And in fact, Turner did not wear a mask for most of the time that he was back out on the field because Friedman was right next to him, and there are pictures. So, but that's not the point, right? Informal communication can be issued and can complicate and can sometimes facilitate your communication strategy. So just as Christians, of course, we need to remember any communication strategy that we use. I love this verse. Our conversation and our communication should always be full of grace. Seasoned with salt. Remember, salt enhances, but it doesn't suffocate or stifle. You put too much salt on the food, I don't want to eat it. You put just enough, it enhances. So good conversation enhances process. It enhances culture. It creates positivity. And it reinforces mission. And just a couple more verses for you to think about as you engage in your own professional communication strategies. So let's move on to how you develop a communication strategy and how you communicate that formally and control informal communication. First, we need to think about what we're trying to say with the message. If you're Rob Manfred, what is the goal for your message? And this can sound overly simple, and yet I've learned and I'm convinced, even regardless of the medium that I choose to communicate, whether I choose social media or television or a press release or even an email, even the smallest type of communication, I should quickly think, what is my goal for this message? And I think that's the first question you have to ask before you ask the others. What medium should I use to communicate, and who should receive it? Do I need to copy everybody on this email or just the key decision makers? Do I need to bring other people in to this discussion? And what is the appropriate channel for communicating? And even the timing. Do I wait to hold off to send it, or do I get the message out as quickly as possible? But it all starts with this goal. Just like thinking about a good essay. I tell my kids over and over again that they get tired of having me say it, but when they ask me for feedback and to read one of their papers, I say, okay, what's your goal for this? What are you trying to say with this? Because we can often think that we're very clear on what our goal for our message is. And I think many times we're not as clear as we need to be. And then if we don't start out being clear in our goal, then everything else can potentially become less effective and efficient. So we've decided on a goal, and we know the other details of who gets it and the timing of it. Now, two slides actually, that just talk about the complexity of the communication process. So if you are Rob Manfred or any sport manager, you are the sender of information through formal and informal channels, and you transmit a message through a medium, through a source or a vehicle, and then the receiver receives the message that you sent and they decode it. This is where the psychology comes in, right? I could be communicating with you, or you could be communicating with a significant other, and you say something and it's decoded and heard and understood. And maybe it's accurate, and maybe it's received in a different way than you intended, and then the fun begins. Yeah, the talking past each other, or the mutual understanding. So remember, and then there's feedback that occurs as the receiver hears and interprets, then it can go back and forth. So this process goes back and forth, and the sender and receiver change roles. And so this is basic communication 101 that hopefully most of you had as an undergrad here. But we often fail to appreciate the complexity of the communication process. So the point of the chapter is, hey, remember, even the most well-intentioned message, if I'm not clear on my goal and I'm not sure how to effectively initiate and transmit the message, then I shouldn't be surprised if the receiver decodes it in a way that is different than I intended. So, and here's why there can be confusion, because we often encode our messages in specific ways, and then receivers often decode it in specific ways and through specific filters, and these are the factors that impact the process. So remember, the whole purpose of communication is transmit information, and as you're transmitting information, we're working on a low-level psychology here where we're trying to establish trust and credibility on both sides. And so factors that can influence the communication process, they're called barriers, can occur on both sides. In the sending of the message, we encode our messages in a lot of different ways. We choose certain words. They can be overly complex, or they can be too simple, or they can be just right. Yeah? They can be aggressive, or they can be diplomatic. And sometimes the level of information we can overwhelm and overload on purpose to try and distract. So all of these barriers can be used effectively or ineffectively. We can over-communicate too much information when less is more. Rob Manfred, if he communicates in simple, direct ways, reminding people of the mission of Major League Baseball. We exist to protect players, to give the best on-the-field product and experience for fans as possible. Ooh, that's nice. Rather than just reciting a litany of all the COVID-related rules. This would be unnecessarily complex and an information overload. So these are all the ways and the barriers that can get in the way of an effective message from the sender. And these, at a deeper level, they can decrease trust and even credibility. We've all seen leaders who just didn't seem to be up to the task of really communicating well, and we've seen how that impacts the believability and even the trust and credibility. And even on the other side of the communication process, there is the receiver who is also engaged in a trust and credibility dynamic, where they're listening to the message, they're interpreting it through their emotions, or they're failing to listen, and we're distorting the message. So the sender can distort the message by not being effective in these areas, but the receiver can also distort and allow emotions to get involved. So Justin Turner could have heard the security guards calling him off the field, but in the emotion of the moment chose to disregard, to not even listen, and to continue to do what he wanted to do, which was to celebrate the first win for the Dodgers in 32 years, right? Even though earlier he said the whole reason they were there is because players were responsible and followed routine and followed rules and he tips his cap to them. In the moment, he could have disregarded the message that Major League Baseball was sending him. So you get the point. It's complex, it's ongoing. And that's the whole point. You as the leader, congratulations. You get to be aware of all this stuff, and you get to communicate through it in ways that are effective. So then in order to do that, this is one of the final slides. You, as the commissioner of baseball in this case, you are faced with a bunch of different channels through which you can send messages and you can transmit information through this communication process. So your book says that there are 4 basic communication channels. Nonverbal, what we do with our hands and smile and face and the tone and the vocal quality. Am I emotional or monotone? Am I loud or quiet? What is my posture like? Am I assertive or am I slouching? And even, is it appropriate for the setting in which we are communicating? So the nonverbal can sometimes speak as loudly as the verbal or the oral, and then we can use written or visual channels as well. The visual obviously could be websites, TV, social media, or programming information. Written could be formal memos or press releases, we say, or formal letters from a commissioner, let's say, to the Players Association. So all these things Manfred will likely use in the coming days in order to manage communication and to get his message out. But, obviously a few words from the chapter would be, depending on what your goal for the communication is, you could use one or the other channel more effectively. So if you really have to work through conflict, if the Players Association is really going to have to talk with Major League Baseball ownership to work on a solution and even a penalty or a fine for Justin Turner, they got to get face-to-face, right? Or through a meeting. There has to be oral communication here in order to work through conflict and to task people with enforcing policy or deciding to let Turner off the hook, right? This can't be done through a memo. This needs to be face-to-face, we would say. And then nonverbal communication in those moments really matters. As you negotiate between Players Association and ownership, we need to remember this encoding, decoding process, and Manfred gets to take the lead for the owners, and then the representative or the president of the Major League Baseball Players Association will take the lead for the players, and then they get to talk it out. So we use the channel that we deem most effective for our communication goal, and that would be the point of this slide. So then, as always, I will post this PowerPoint on Blackboard so that you can look through some of the other slides that I didn't cover in this video, but I give some examples from other commissioners and other leagues about effective communication, well-timed, or ineffective communication. In this case, it's an example I've shared previously about the NBA and the NFL's response to players standing or kneeling for the national anthem and showing what's effective or ineffective about those messages. But remember, regardless of the medium and the channel that we choose and how we encode and engage in the decoding process, feedback can be really key, and our ability to learn and to communicate more effectively is often limited by our ability to get good feedback. This is important, and it's just something I'll say to you as emerging leaders and managers. Don't be afraid or too prideful to ask people for feedback about your communication. Obviously, sometimes you have to do that in private, one-on-one, and other times you do it in a group setting. But one of the best ways I've heard, and hopefully you're listening and will write this down and remember it, is when you're with people, your people, and you're making decisions, every meeting I would ask people the question, what are you not telling me that you don't want to tell me? Yeah, that sounds weird, but after all the brainstorming and after all the back and forth and negotiating, it's a really good idea to ask for feedback, honest feedback with that question, what do you not want to tell me right now? And sometimes you'll get, oh, no, we're all good. But other times, just asking the question will give people permission to tell you what they're struggling with, what they're still processing. A fantastic question that I very rarely hear my leaders asking me, and I certainly don't want to be guilty of it. So just spent a little time to give you that little wisdom, I think. Ask that question of people regularly, and you'll get good feedback that you need to modify your communication during tough times of decision. So here's a final slide on listening, analyzing what people are saying. So as the leader, you also are decoding messages that your teammates and colleagues are sending you. So good listening strategies can seem obvious, but they can be difficult to develop. So analyzing what people are saying, checking for understanding to make sure you're not misinterpreting, or if you're not so to make sure that you're not inserting barriers in that decoding process. So I just put this for those of you who watch The Office. Don't be a Dwight Schrute of The Office. You can YouTube this where he's I think some of the ladies in The Office are teaching him how to sell specifically to a female audience, but they're trying to teach him to be an active listener, and he's bombing on it pretty good. So if you want to know what not to do, YouTube that real quick, look it up. So we're done. Thanks so much for listening. Now here's the payoff. And if you fast forwarded to just get to this slide, that's okay too. But I'll give you at least 10 points of extra credit, maybe even 15. If you give me some responses related to your communication strategy. Remember, you are Rob Manfred, the Major League Baseball commissioner, and I just want you to write a couple paragraphs in response to these 4 guiding questions. How will you initiate formal communication to reinforce policy to ensure that you're protecting athletes related to Turner's kind of defiant act of going onto the field? How will you seek feedback regarding this formal communication? What channels will you implement, and what types of communication? Obviously, you will be engaged in communication with a national audience and a fan base, and then you'll be in communication with the Players Association and Turner specifically. And remember, you're trying to build the brand of Major League Baseball. Real quickly, I read yesterday that Major League Baseball stands to lose, goodness, $3 billion. Quickly, they thought they were going to make $10 billion in revenue before COVID hit. They ended up making $3 billion, but yet they spent less as well. They spent a few billion less than they anticipated. So there was a net loss of revenue of $3 billion. What's my point? Major League Baseball needs to make some money. They need to increase fan base. So this does impact how you communicate with the public regarding Justin Turner. So have fun with this. Send me an email with your responses, and I'll give you extra credit. You can do this anytime this week until tomorrow, Friday night, and just send me an email, and I'll give you extra credit, okay? Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this practical application of the importance of communication in sport organizations. Have a great weekend. I'll see you next week, okay?